Hi, Isaiah. How are you? I was hoping you could introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your current position.
Yeah, so I'm Isaiah Speight. I'm currently assistant professor at William and Mary over in Williamsburg, Virginia. I am by training an inorganic chemist, but by interest a just general synthetic chemist. I like to just make cool things, and whatever that cool thing is for the day is what we're going to tackle. I do run a primarily undergraduate research group at William and Mary, where our focus is sustainable chemistry. And so we bounce around different topics, but our key focus is sustainability from three different avenues. Sustainability in chemistry from a synthesis and waste perspective. So, how we do chemistry, how much waste we're generating, and how we can mitigate that from a financial stance, so how much it costs to do chemistry and how we can lower the barrier to entry to certain types of chemistry. And then from an educational stance, how we teach people to do chemistry and what ways we're looking at modernizing the chemical education environment. But all of it kind of ties into this sustainable mindset where we're attacking problems day to day in different ways.
That's great. And you and I have spoken in person a couple times at ACS meetings, and I believe you were there representing a student organization. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so NOBCChE actually is a national organization for students and professionals. So at the time when we met, I believe I was still on the board, but NOBCChE stands for the National Organization for the Professional Advancement of Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers. And so the organization's main mission is to create a group or space for Black chemists to be themselves, to feel like they're empowered, to create opportunities for them within the scientific space, and really truly just to be advocates for each other in spaces where they may not have another advocate to turn to. So the organization is coast to coast. We just turned 50, I think, 2 years ago, which is pretty awesome. And I think the most beautiful thing about Novachet is the true level of support, but also the creativity that you find at Novachet in all the different areas, right? Creativity as scientists, creativity as professionals, creativity as entrepreneurs, and the support that the organization generates from chapter to chapter, meeting to meeting. There's no moment where you feel isolated within Novachet or feel like somebody's out of reach. I've seen first time attendees come to the meeting and talk to the president of the organization just as if they've known each other forever. And the organization really prides itself on creating a space where people can feel safe. And that's really like my personal take on Nobuche and what it is. It is a professional organization, it is a scientific organization, but there's always an air of comfort there that makes it easy for people to come, new or old, to come back and just feel safe, feel empowered, feel inspired, and go back to wherever they came in from for the meetings or for the sessions and really feel like they could take that next step.
That's awesome. That's so good to hear. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in March at the next ACS event. I was hoping we could talk about the synthetic chemistry group. You mentioned utilizing HPLC and flash chromatography, so I was curious how that fit into your workflow.
Yeah, so even though I broadly call ourselves synthetic, right, we do have a more targeted focus towards organic chemistry, mainly because that's what the institution hired me for. So I had to rein it in just a little bit. But whenever it comes to just doing synthetic chemistry, not every reaction goes according to plan, right? When we teach organic chemistry, we typically teach students that reagent A and reagent B come together and make reagent C, but any card-carrying organic chemist will tell you no reaction does that 100% of the time. And there's always either some byproduct or some impurity that you may have introduced by doing the reaction or may have been a contaminant from the material that you purchased. And that's where chromatography really comes into play, being able to separate molecules and to isolate purified compounds are very important to synthetic chemists. If every reaction that I didn't have a way to clean up afterwards, then essentially all I would be doing is carrying forward junk. And I might isolate a large amount of material, but that material isn't truly useful, right? And so by using techniques such as flash chromatography to separate molecules after a reaction, or HPLC, which we can use to determine reaction conversions, purity of products, for quick assessments, that allows us to elevate the quality of the product that we're isolating and give better data in other spaces. Nobody's going to trust an NMR spectra where there are plenty of other peaks that don't relate to the molecule of interest. So chromatography really is truly important to organic chemistry. Yeah, there are plenty of other ways to purify, but if you don't know, I can crystallize that compound or what temperature to distill it at, falling back to the fundamentals of chromatography will give you an easier option to get to that purified compound rather than having to run the risk of introducing more problems in other spaces.
That makes sense. And I think you may have just touched on that a little bit, but could you talk about some of the key advantages of using automated flash chromatography compared to maybe more traditional manual columns?
Mhm. I think that there's a beauty in both, right? And so for the students that are just starting or for the trainees that are just getting their hands, figured out, running that manual flash column gives you an appreciation for using automated systems that you wouldn't have if you just started there. Figuring out which eluents to use, learning how to pack a column, learning about flow rate, and understanding those fundamentals that you may have gotten introduced to in an analytical class or an instrumentation class that by just jumping straight to the automated system, you don't have to worry about. But once you've gotten to that space where you really understand what chromatography is, automated systems are just so wonderful. You don't have to sit and wait. You can teach it or give it different eluents to use and set it on gradients and things of that nature. Things that might be a little too complicated for the manual user, right? Imagine having to make a small adjustment in your eluent to increase polarity in stepwise manners. Running a manual column, you don't get that level of refinement that you can get from an automated system. And so I find the automated systems to be very robust, especially when you have a good understanding of the separation you need to do. But also just the ease of scaling automated systems nowadays, right? Like just plug in a cartridge, tell it how much material you have, give it a method to run, and then just walk away, right? I spent a year in industry, and before that, I was running a lot of manual columns. But when I got to industry, and really got comfortable using automated systems, I was like, man, like this is awesome. But it took running those manual columns to have a true appreciation of what the automated system can do rather than just treating it as a plug and play. It's really a robust system that can take some of the most difficult separations and make them easy. But every once in a while, that manual touch is still necessary.
Absolutely. Could you talk about some of the factor or criteria that would go into choosing HPLC or flash chromatography for your separation?
So for us, we use HPLC less for full separation and more for reaction monitoring or reaction checks. And so what we typically do is we'll perform a reaction, take a small portion of it and make a sample, and then use that to give us data to further optimize the system. So we'll use it to understand reaction conversions, comparing peak areas of a starting material to a product, or even in some cases to an impurity that we may want to mitigate. And understanding these conditions lead us to this point, we need to either dial back or move forward, maybe change a certain reagent, increase a certain equivalency. But we use HPLC truly to understand the reaction's progress. That's what I learned to use HPLC for when I was in industry. We did what were called in-process checks, where you would take a reaction and as it's going, sample it to see how far the reaction is complete. And once you hit a certain threshold, maybe 5% or less of a certain compound or 10% or less of a certain compound, then we know that we can move on to the next reactionary step or to the next operation. But for us right now in my lab, it's truly just to make sure that reactions are performing as necessary to help with method development. For the flash piece, that's where we really get into isolation and purity and understanding, how best to get to that product of interest and to make sure that it is obtained in a way that makes us feel good, right? Being able to say, hey, I've got this product. Yes, by HPLC, this reaction is fully converted. There's no more starting material left behind, but there are other things in the system that either maybe HPLC didn't pick up or our method may have had it run off of the window that we're measuring by. Maybe its limited detection is too low. Maybe that byproduct isn't UV active. And that's where chromatography, such as flash or even TLC to do other checks, is really useful because now we've got other tools that we can use. Using TLC, we can then stain, and the things that might not be UV active that HPLC doesn't see, we can now see using different stains to identify different functional groups or different moieties. And then using that knowledge, we can say, all right, we know that there are these other things in the system. How do we separate it away from the product of interest? And that allows us to get really good, maybe even crystal data if that molecule is purified very well, NMR data, proton, carbon NMR, IR if necessary. Some cases, we might even want to get melting point data if we're trying to relate this back to a teaching lab demonstration. And so, good chromatography in either of these stages kind of works hand in hand in method development, which is what a lot of my group does.
Yeah, and I was hoping you could continue with talking about your method development just to try to understand the process of looking at that new compound or that reaction and how flash chromatography applies when you figure out, oh, this is the right thing for us to use here.
Yeah, so a lot of our group's work is solvent minimal, ironically enough. So we are a mechanochemistry forward group. By definition, mechanochemistry is the use of mechanical force to drive reactions. And so by using mechanochemistry, a lot of our reactions are done solvent free or solvent minimal. And so after that reaction is finished, then we fall back to traditional organic methodologies such as thin layer chromatography or flash chromatography when it's necessary. But the same process that most traditional synthetic organic chemists use is where we are. You find a set of conditions to start from, either by diving through the literature or being inspired by other people's chemistry or going to a talk or just, serendipity in some cases. Once that initial hit is found, then we rely a lot on HPLC to optimize to get to the best conditions possible. Then once we find those conditions, we may scale the reaction up just a little bit to make flash isolation easier for us. And so once we get those optimized conditions, we run the reaction and we know we need to purify afterwards. Then we go through a separate process of tuning our chromatography systems, using TLC to understand what the best solvent mixture is, so whether we need a more polar or less polar solvent mixture, whether we might need to use a gradient to get that separation to occur easily. In some cases, maybe having to spike the system. So a lot of people will spike with acid if they're using amines to keep them from streaking on the column, things of that nature. And so, all of these different things that have to happen, there's almost a second optimization that has to occur when it comes to doing chromatography. So you've got your reaction in hand, but if you can't purify that molecule, your method is useless, right? And so using the same tool, same chemical intuition to find the best chromatography method is where that second set of skills kicks in. And then once we've got that system, either by playing around with TLC or even running small columns to figure out the best way to isolate, then we'll bring the system even larger in scale and see how its chromatography scales as well. Isolate that material, report a yield, report a spectra, report a purification method, because that's really important. And I wish more people were a lot more detailed with their chromatography in their publications. But all of this then culminates into a full-blown method. Since we are solvent minimal, we try to avoid using columns as much as possible because columns can generate a lot of solvent waste if not handled properly. It's gonna become easier for a lot of groups with the EPA minimizing a lot of chlorinated waste. But even then, running a hand column on, let's say, 250 milligrams can generate maybe a liter or more of solvent waste after you've done your purification, right? You pack your column, you run the column, you isolate the material, you remove all the solvent from the product, and now you still got all of the solvent that you have to figure out what to do with it. You know, chromatography is extremely important, so we don't jump straight to the let's avoid it, but we do try to minimize when we use it to prevent creating a large waste footprint that we've mitigated by doing the reaction solvent free.
Where I can relate to what you just said is trying to look at the sample preparation steps utilized, because sometimes that could be a major focus of the report or poster presentation. Other times I really have to dig into it to try to figure out what was done because I'm saying, oh, I think my evaporator could fit here, but I'm not really sure because you haven't mentioned any of your sample preparation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that like as science has evolved and as processes have become more difficult, the level of detail that's required in publications and in supplemental information has gotten so high and it's made publications so much better. The best papers are the ones where you can go to the SI and you don't have to do any guesswork. You don't have to worry about whether they used a certain amount of solvent to prep the sample or what concentration they were running their systems at, or whether they used a gradient or not, whether they report an isocratic system or not. All of that detail is there. Those are the papers that make chemistry easy, and that's what is so important, right? Like even you just said, you go to a poster presentation and people are talking through their work, and a lot of people focus on the big result, right? I got this crystal structure, or I made this compound, or I developed this method. But the little details are still important, right? Did you run a column on this or not? Were you able to isolate this thing from some other method, right? Did you use reverse phase? Did you use a different solid phase? What were your mobile phases? Did you have to spike or not? Those are the conversations that make chemistry so much more robust for everybody. And so I do enjoy, right, when I see students who have pictures of their method or they talk about that stuff on the front end, right? It just makes it so much more of a rich conversation seeing students talk about that detail and seeing professors give that in their talks or seeing industry professionals talk about what methods they use. All of this culminates into a much more robust area for synthesis. And so I agree with you. When you can find that person who's already talking about that stuff, you're going to have a great conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was hoping if you're willing, you could talk about any projects you're willing to share with the audience, whether completed or are ongoing, because yeah, you do a lot of interesting work.
Yeah, so we don't have anything completed right now, but we do have some projects that are pretty interesting. Right now, our group is a part of the NSF Center for Mechanical Control of Chemistry, or CMCC, and we engage in a couple of different areas within the center. Right now, we have two active projects working with the center, one of which is 3D printed mechanochemical reaction vessels. And so this fits into our overarching goal of financial sustainability in chemistry, right? Using 3D printing to lower the cost entry to doing mechanochemistry. Not every lab has the funds to go and buy a ball mill and use it just for mechanochemistry, but majority of synthetic labs will have a rotary evaporator. And so if we can 3D print reaction vessels that can be retrofitted onto the rotovat, now you've got a low cost entry method. 3D printers have become a lot more affordable over the years. You can essentially make your own reactor at home and then toss it on a rotovac, and now you've got a cheap way to essentially reinvent the wheel of what that rotovac was used for. So now it's got even more purpose and your dollar stretches. So I have three students now working on that project. Amelia Klaus, Vanessa Dunu, and Angela Liu. In addition to that work, we're also starting to get into an area called mechanocatalysis, where we're using the surface of our reaction vessels as catalytic resources. So imagine you've got a jar that's made out of a metal. Can you use that surface to do organometallic transformations? And so our big focus is copper, just because I think copper is a really cool metal. So we're playing around in that space. And then another project that I'm cool with discussing is way out there, right? So I talked about all the sustainability stuff, and I've got a student who came in and immediately wanted to turn left. But my student Theo is spearheading a project that's a three-way collaboration between us, Caltech, and Hosea Nelson's group, and then University of Birmingham and Tomislav Frischik's group, where we're looking at the fringe of metal organic framework chemistry. Theo is designing methods towards making mercury-centered metal organic frameworks and seeing how using that heavy metal with a lot of relativistic effects can change structure function agreement in metal organic frameworks. So we do a lot of the synthetic work to make the metal organic frameworks. We then feed a lot of our data and samples to Caltech, where Hosea Nelson's group will do micro ED to do structural confirmation. And then we take that structured data and give it back to University of Birmingham, where Tomislav is also interfacing with another PI there, Andy Morris, who is then using AI and machine learning to almost predict other structures that we might see, and then they feed that data back to us to do more experimental work to see if we can identify some of the structures that they predicted or even see structures that they didn't. And so it almost creates this catalytic cycle where it starts with us doing experimental data, then feeds to Hosea that does structural analysis, that then feeds to Andy and Tomislav, where they predict the next set of conditions to try, and then it comes back. So those are some of
That's
the
so
projects that
cool.
I can freely talk about. We have a couple of other things that are on the stove, cooking up, but we can't discuss yet. So you'll just have to stay tuned to see what comes out of our group when we're ready.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like I'll be seeing you at least twice in 2025. So I will connect with you in person. But yeah, thanks so much for sitting down. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the time. I really appreciate it, and thanks for giving me a chance to share what my group has been up to and talk about how important chromatography is to anybody, even the synthetic chemist who doesn't like using solvent.